November 7th, another day in the courtroom in Ada County, Idaho. Bryan Kohberger, Idaho 4 case. We're inching closer day by day to trial. And as you can see, today was just kind of a wasted day within the courtroom. Even though we learned a couple of very important things. One, we have a judge that's on top of things. When a motion is filed, he educates himself to the fullest to be able to understand, maybe even better so than the attorneys who wrote the motion to the court. He can actually articulate each point and interrupt when something just isn't quite being stated appropriately. He listens and he weighs it all out. And he doesn't make a rash, quick decision. But let me tell you, this judge, Judge Hippler, is a much different, whole, altogether spectacle than what Judge was. This man's on top of it, and he's going to hold people accountable. And this is going to get to trial. And he's going to do it appropriately and in the right manner. Now, we watched today what I call a forced hearing in regards to the fact that the defense had to file these motions regarding the death penalty, whether they wanted to or not, whether they actually believed them or not. This was something they had to do by law. This is in protection of Bryan Kohberger's rights. Now, there were parts of this that were very important that I personally myself, in my very opinion, think the defense failed miserably in presenting their case in a manner that would sway a judge to rule in their favor. And that's in regards to the speedy trial waiver, that this, in many people's thoughts and opinions, including myself, was literally wrong of our government and our judicial system to push Bryan Kohberger to have to waive his speedy trial rights. And I guarantee you, without a doubt, even the people who have already found Bryan Kohberger guilty, in the pit of their stomach, in the back of their minds, they know what happened to Bryan Kohberger and the fact that he had to waive his speedy trial due to the lack of discoverable evidence being turned over in a timely manner cost him his rights. That's a constitutional right. Not only is it a constitutional right, as we heard today in the very courtroom, it's an Idaho jurisdictional right. And as a matter of fact, the way that they're written, if you really listened and deciphered what they were saying, they contradict each other. But at the end of the day, the defense fell far short of the wanted goal line when it came to the argument of the speedy trial. I get what they were trying to accomplish, and I know exactly how Bryan Kohberger, deep down inside of himself, feels when it comes to that speedy trial. He wants that option back. He never wanted to waive it in the first place, but he felt pressured to do so. And unfortunately, it's not even pressured just by the basics that the prosecution had not made the evidence discoverable. No. Bryan Kohberger is extremely frustrated in the fact that it has to go through each and every step that a capital case has to go through, including the mitigating circumstances and also the sentencing guidelines that capital cases are forced to go through. I know many people would come at me and say, I don't have the exact experience that it would need to speak in regards to capital cases because I have not faced a death penalty capital case. And that's true. I have, however, twice in my lifetime faced 25 to life without the possibility of parole, life sentence cases that were felony ones that were not quite capital, but they were just below it, and they were being charged both on the state and the federal jurisdictional side. I was going to have to serve a life sentence both in the state penitentiary, but my crimes within the criminal syndicate that I was working within carried enough federal points to earn me a life without parole sentence in the feds as well. However, where some of my experience actually falls when it comes to discussing capital cases and the way that they work themselves unfairly through the court system comes from some of my ex-good buddies that sit on death row in 3 different states. Thank God I never went down a path of criminal activity that could possibly have earned me capital punishment, because that literally would create anxiety within somebody, including myself. So I understand the argument of the death penalty. I get it. I understand it. 143-page motion detailed out numerous cases and the basis that they were trying to achieve. But I don't think that this actual day in the court was focalized on getting the death penalty stricken from this case, because we all know whoever committed this quadruple homicide is certainly death penalty eligible. We don't need to discuss whether this case deserves the death penalty or not, because I believe the majority of everybody who actually understands the death penalty and isn't opposed to the death penalty itself understands this is a case that jurisdictionally carries death penalty ramifications as a sentencing guideline. At the end of the day, I feel as though it's going to be more like the outcome of the Jodi ARHayes case, where it's going to be a lifetime sentence without the possibility of parole. Because legitimately, most people, even when you're sentenced to death, you sit on death row for 30, 40, 50 years. Now, the main argument that I legitimately inside was really attracted to and wanted to see play out differently was the speedy trial argument. I wanted to see the tenacious bulldog that Ann Taylor is, and so is Massa. Those two ladies have a power to their voice and a convincing method of discussing these types of things that can sway most into understanding and following what they're having to say. They didn't bring that game today, and Judge Hippler is a totally different type of beast than most. This man, you could tell, and if I was sitting in the defendant's chair, I would know right away just by looking at his mannerisms and the way that he speaks, even interrupting the attorneys to speak more fact about the cases that they're trying to showcase within their arguments, that he knows maybe more than they even do. This man, with this 143-page motion, began its way into his visions, into his eyesight of having to go over it. He studied it, and he went and studied those cases and the laws, and he was prepared. You see, when we go back and we bring Judge back into our memories and what we saw of that man, he seemed confused at all times and not up to date on the actual cases and the findings that were being presented to him to help him make his decisions on motions. Judge Hippler, totally different beast. I don't think it's a bad thing for the defense. I don't want people to get the idea that I'm saying this is going to be the downfall of the defense, that we all of a sudden have a judge that's prosecutory, kind of leaning in the direction of the prosecutors. I don't believe that at all. I believe we have an educated man on the bench that's going to weigh out exactly what the law states, and then he's going to look through the different cases presented to him to help him in his best judgment before making a decision. And I think that's important. Now, one thing I will tell you, he is strict upon his guidelines of time. So I'm going to be keeping I want to use the words eyes open, but for those of you that know my medical conditions right now, you probably understand. I'm going to be keeping my ears open and my mind open to the fact I want to see when he sets time frames and sets parameters of when things have to be done by, if anybody oversteps that boundary and oversteps that time frame, is he going to slam down his gavel and hold them accountable and punish them? I have a feeling he will. But let's get back real quick into the discussion of the waiving of the speedy trial. See, I truly felt, just based off of my experiences, this case never had a chance of seeing a speedy trial, but I was not prepared in my mind to see a prosecuting office bring charges in this manner against a suspect, a defendant that's being charged with quadruple homicide, and they could not bring the main keys to the discoverable evidence immediately. That's what the investigation is. That's why it's so important. That's why the resources and the financial means are put into these investigations, so that they can feel as though they can work their way through without the pressure of a time frame. Of course, you want to catch a defendant, you want to catch a suspect as quickly as you possibly can, but you want to utilize the steps appropriately to do so. You want to put all your eggs and gather them nice and tight into that basket, knowing that there's not a possibility of them shattering or falling out because you've left loose ends. Well, this investigation is far more than loose ends. And I get circumstantial evidence can weigh a lot into the decision of jurors and those making the decision on guilt or not guilty. I get that. But you've got to tie that circumstantial evidence all together for it to make sense. To some right now, this case makes sense, and that's because they're living in a fairy tale world that our investigators and our justice system works like a well-oiled machine. It never makes mistakes. And that's foolish. That's foolish. Because here recently, just over the last few years, we're seeing mistake after mistake after mistake. And now we're even looking into the old cases, and we're even looking into the forensics labs and different people that are involved in these investigations, and realizing it's sometimes even more than a mistake. It's intentional. I completely understand how important it is to solve a crime like the Idaho 4 quadruple homicide. I 100% understand, and I agree, it is important. We don't want to see a case like this go cold. And I hear the chirps, and I hear the beeping behind me of everybody honking their horns about how there's a gag order and all this about the evidence isn't known at this point. Well, sadly, you're right. The evidence is not known at this point because even the defendant and the defense team of attorneys don't know it, because it hasn't been turned over in full through the discovery. And if it had been, we wouldn't be on our 18th motion after the deadline for discoverable evidence to be turned over. 18th motion for discovery. Come on, ladies and gentlemen, is this really how we want our judicial system to work? We want it to be so heavily scrutinized and criticized because it just isn't making sense anymore, to the fact now you have a defendant making a very legitimate argument that he potentially was forced to make a decision in regards to his speedy trial rights. Or does he go to trial without knowing all the evidence that could actually not find him guilty, ladies and gentlemen? Not the evidence that could potentially find him guilty. It's the evidence that could help him build a defense for himself to help find him as not guilty. You get that? That's where the problem is. We're not fighting over the guilty evidence. We're fighting over the legitimate evidence that could potentially show Bryan Kohberger as not the culprit of the crime. But that's the decision that he had to make. Do I go to trial with everything stacked against me and try to fight that? Or do I go ahead and waive my speedy trial, my speedy rights? This is a right to all defendants, including myself when I was going through the system, that we have to weigh out because we are the ones sitting within that cell waiting. Do we waive that right and spend more time in that cell, even though within our hearts and in our minds we know we're innocent? But we need to be able to get the prosecutors and the justice system to stand up and legitimately turn over the evidence that could help us showcase our case. Why do people that have found Bryan Kohberger not realize it's not always about the gag order holding back the information of the evidence that finds Bryan Kohberger guilty? What about the gag order holding back the very potential of the evidence that finds him not guilty? Come on, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we have to keep an open mind. That's why we can't prejudge someone like Bryan Kohberger, who potentially at the age of 14 stole a cell phone, or maybe he had a little bit of an addiction issue. That doesn't mean he's a quadruple murderer. I was an extensive criminal, and I was not a quadruple murderer. And I had just the same issues at home as maybe Bryan Kohberger did. We don't know the whole truth. Who legitimately has stepped forward that could tell the legitimate entire story of Bryan Kohberger as a person? I haven't seen his family step forward. Have you? Have you seen his family step forward and discuss what Bryan Kohberger was as a child, what he went through, what he endured, the type of maybe counseling that he went to? No, you haven't heard that. You've heard people on the outside, peripheral vision type people that didn't know Bryan Kohberger or his home situation at all. And that's why these mitigating circumstances and the whole thing that the defense has to do. Ladies and gentlemen, many people would say that this hearing was just another stall tactic by the defense. They had to do it. You have to fight the death penalty. You have no option to not do it. It's required. It's mandated of a defense team to fight the death penalty in a capital case. I just wish people would understand that nobody's stalling. They're doing their job. But the only person right now that's actually enduring the pain of it all is Bryan Kohberger. And the only thing that he's done since the very beginning is declare his innocence. What more do you want of the man? What more do you want of Bryan Kohberger? There's a gag order, remember? Bryan Kohberger can't come out and tell you the story. Can't even tell you where he was on that fateful night because there's a gag order. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I had to get on here real quick. I've missed all of you, and yes, I am battling some health issues, but I got more to come before I take my little trip off to surgery land to try to get some situations rectified before the holiday season. And I hope all of you are doing well. I'm learning day by day what it's like to overcome the trials and tribulations of life, and I know many of you are in very similar situations. And I wish all of you guys so much love, and I give you all my support as well. Jen and I open our hearts to each and every single one of you, and we thank all of you for being right here with us as a family that we are. Have a good night, ladies and gentlemen. See you again soon.